Yes, good afternoon. This is Monday, October the 5th, and today we are going to continue our discussion of the ways that England and France develop governments. Once again, the whole chapter. You want to sum up the chapter in one sentence, it's this. England, because they did the English monarchs because they did not have a um, efficient way of taking money from their populace, had to develop a constitutional parliamentary monarchy where the king shared power with parliament. France, on the other hand, quite simple. The French king could take money right out of the pockets of the French people. Um, he, however, of course, did not tax the nobility and the clergy. Say again, the French king did not tax the nobility and the clergy, the two richest segments of English society. And so, yes, let's get into that discussion. We are talking about, the last thing we talked about yesterday was Oliver Cromwell. You know, the English Civil War saw the defeat of the Stuart King Charles I, saw his beheading, and then for the next 11 years, Oliver Cromwell ruled England under the title of Lord Protector. He was a Puritan, and he tried to, and did for a while, make England a puritanical republic, the original no fun zone. In the middle of doing that, he conquered Scotland, the people who had helped them come to power, and he also pounded Ireland into the dirt and made Ireland, England's first real colony. Yeah, I mean, eventually the Scottish were kind of accepted as part of England, and by part of England, I mean they were accepted not as equals but as English. Although I will say that when the English, and you should make note of this, when the English conquered Scotland and Wales and Ireland, they did not allow the Scotch to continue to speak Celtic. They did not allow the Welsh to continue to speak Welsh, and they did not allow the Irish to continue to speak Gaelic. I've been to those three countries, and in each of those three countries, there is a movement on to bring back the old languages. In fact, in Ireland, all signs are written both in Gaelic but also in English, and the same thing in Wales. And hopefully, by the way, if you're looking at a map of England, and you guys who are in the class, look at the map of England. England, the UK as it's called now, is comprised of, the UK is comprised of today England, but also Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. But anyway, and so today there is a movement going on to bring back Gaelic in Ireland, and you hear it spoken, and as well as to bring back Welsh in Wales, and you hear it spoken, as well as to bring back the Celtic language of Scotland. I mean, when the English came, they basically said, you're not going to be whatever ethnicity you are. You're not going to be Scottish anymore. You're going to quit wearing the kilts, and you're going to quit worshiping Presbyterian Calvinist faith. You're going to accept English traditions, and you're going to speak English. And they did that, but they were most cruel to the Irish. The English thought the Irish were really some kind of backwards, barely human creatures. And I'm not lying. The prejudice that the Irish faced first against England and then later when they went to the United States of America is the same kind of racial prejudice that the Jews faced in Europe, but also that African Americans faced, and also that Latinos face today, and Chinese on the West Coast. Um, you see, and if you think about this, the things that people say or assume about many of the ethnic minorities of this country today, whether those minorities be Latino or African American or Muslims, the Muslims who are coming into this country, or the other peoples from Asia who come to this country and struggle, particularly in the early stages, they said the same about the Irish. The Irish were alcoholic. They were given to brawling. They were not educated. They were irresponsible in that they had massive, large families of children and seemed to do nothing but continue to propagate all the time. And yeah, the Irish faced prejudice both in England, but also in the United States when they came here. In fact, a lot of establishments see Irish history is one of my favorite subjects. And the Irish, when they came here, faced prejudice for decades in this country because there were so many of them. Remember that today, our people of Irish ethnicity make up about 21% of the population. Yeah, 21%. Actually, more so than people of English descent. Yeah. And when they first came here, and many came here out of desperation, they were desperately poor because of the Irish potato famine. They lived in the slums of the various cities they moved into. And of course, living in those slums, they were looked down upon. There were signs that said Irishmen and dogs need not apply. Of course, and the Irish were called paddies, which is a reference to St. Patrick. And I'm off the subject, but that's okay. Horton's rambling. And so, yes, Oliver Cromwell conquered, crushed the Irish, made them into a colony. Now, and this is worthwhile knowledge, that Ireland became the prototype. You know what a prototype is, don't you? A prototype is a first model of something. A prototype is, when they're trying to develop a car, they will develop several prototypes. Well, Ireland was a prototype British colony. And the British treated the Irish the same way that they will later on treat people in South Africa, people in India, the people in Hong Kong. That little sign, that little picture I showed you is very accurate. You please take a look at that picture. It's very accurate as far as the way England is depicted in both British but also in American history books, because the United States thinks of itself as a British offspring, a direct descendant of the British. In many ways, we are. But that other creature, that is the way that the British are seen in South Africa, in India, particularly in Burma, and many of the other places they took over, Nigeria, for example, and of course, Ireland. Yes. When the British took over Ireland under Oliver Cromwell, since Cromwell had used not only British armies to defeat the Irish, they'd also used Scottish generals. And to placate the Scots, who still were itching under British rule, they gave many of the Scots the land in Ireland. In other words, they took land from the Irish who owned it in Ireland and gave it to the Scottish. Because I'm telling you, I've been to Ireland, and Ireland is a lush green land. It's a farming paradise. It produces easily much more. It exports food, and yeah, when people think of Ireland, they think of the color green, and that's very real because Ireland is a green country. And the British took all the best land and gave it to these Scottish, primarily landlords. And by the way, that's where the word Scots-Irish comes from. It's not a mixture of people who are Scottish and Irish. Those are Scots who've been transplanted in Ireland, many of whom moved to the Americas. For example, Andrew Jackson was Scots-Irish, a poor Scots-Irishman. And don't get me talking about Andrew Jackson. He makes me angry. Now, of course, when you go take Mr. Margrave in APUS, he thinks Andrew Jackson's some kind of a hero. I think he's a butcher, and they need to take him off the $20 bill, but that's okay. But anyway, so the British took away their land, and the Irish who lived there had to pay taxes, not just to the British government, but to the Anglican Church, a church they did not go to. And the Irish could not practice their Roman Catholicism, which is one reason why Roman Catholicism is so strong in Ireland today. For so many years, it was suppressed. Fact of the matter was, until 1832, the practice of Roman Catholicism was not only forbidden in Ireland, but the public saying of a mass, a Catholic church service in Ireland, was a capital offense, meaning that it brought a death sentence. Yeah. I'm keeping an eye on the clock, so forgive me. So anyway, where was I? Yeah, so they took away their language. They took away their Catholic religion, even though Catholicism was still practiced underground. In fact, how many of you out there, Mr. Arlinghouse, how many of you out there have ever heard the song, The 12 Days of Christmas? Mr. York has, yes. And I'm sure Mr. York knows because he's had two older brothers that took this class. And I'm sure they discuss AP Euro just into the wee hours of the morning. But anyway, did you know that the 12 Days of Christmas is actually an anagram? The song sounds whimsical and doesn't sound like it means anything, but what it actually is, the 12 Days of Christmas was a way for an Irish monk. He composed this codified, and it was an Irish monk, this codified song that could be remembered to teach Irish Catholic children about the catechism. Now that Mr. Arlinghouse can tell us all about, and hopefully one day he will. But yeah, that's where it came from. And so yeah, the British took away their Irish Catholic faith, although they couldn't really take it away. They took away their land, and so all these poor Irish were forced to they went from being landowners to land renters. Desperately poor land renters. For example, it was not uncommon for the Irish poor who lived along the coastline. And, Irish coastline can be very rocky and doesn't have good soil. And so what these Irish poor people would do, they would go down to the beach and they would make a box out of wood or maybe a burlap sack. And they put sand in the box and they dragged that, because they didn't have animals, they dragged that back up to their little tiny plot of land that they had set aside by using stones. They didn't have enough, there were no trees, not enough to build fences. They set aside these inside their stone grounds, and they poured out the sand there and went back and got more sand and mixed in seaweed so it would die and rot. And that's what they farmed. They grew their crops in there. And one of the biggest blessings, and I hope you're still writing about this. I am not sitting here talking to you to be flapping my gums. This is going to come back and hit you in the face. Trust me. One of the biggest blessings and curses to the Irish, we're going to talk a lot about Ireland. One of the biggest blessings and curses to the Irish was the potato. The potato was a crop that flourished in Ireland because the climate was exactly right. Because Ireland has a maritime climate. You say, what's a maritime climate? Maritime climate is like what they have in upstate Washington and Oregon before global warming took over. But yeah, and where you have warm, and I don't mean hot, I mean warm, rainy winters, chilly, rainy summers with some snow. But yeah, and in the acidic soil of Ireland, potatoes really grew well. And not only that, they could grow a lot of potatoes. 1 acre of potatoes, planted potatoes, could feed an entire Irish family for a year. Now, the problem was that's basically all they had to eat, which was kind of actually okay because get this stat, the average Irish person prior to the Great Potato Famine of 1849, the average Irish person ate between 10 and 12, one person, 10 and 12 pounds of potatoes per day. Now you wrap your head around that and say, oh, I could never eat that many potatoes. You could if it was all you ate. And you probably said, oh, 10 to 12 pounds of potatoes, that's so much. No way did they eat that. Well, you have to remember, A, that potatoes, like all other plants, are mostly water. B, and here's the cool thing, potatoes can provide all the basic nutrients that a body needs, except for vitamin A. Vitamin A is supplied by, they cook the potatoes in either grease or some kind of milk product, which provides the vitamin A, and suddenly you have a balanced, poor diet, starchy diet, but the Irish thrived. They had lots, and being Catholic, they had lots of children. A lot of children is a sign of the favor of God. They had lots of children. The problem was they had lots of children, didn't have anything to dress them in. Children running around in rags, naked. I mean, poverty, abject poverty in Ireland. And of course, the British, because they looked at the Irish, they saw a bunch of poor people, people who were not necessarily educated, people who drank a lot, people who seemed to not want to work. The British thought so. And I'm telling you, the stereotype that the average British had for the average Irish person is the same type of stereotype that you find that racist people have about ethnic minorities in this country. It's horrible, and yet that's what they had. And sorry to get way off the subject, but Ireland is something I'm passionate about. Yeah, I've been in Ireland, and it is a beautiful country. Let me describe Ireland to you. Ireland is like if you went to Eastern Kentucky, and probably a lot of you have been to Eastern Kentucky, and they cleaned it up. You get me? You feel me? Yeah. If you went to Eastern Kentucky and you got all the trash out of the streams and the junk cars off the roads and things of that nature, Ireland is just beautiful rolling lands with farms, stone walls that are still there from when the poor Irish grew up there. Narrowest roads you ever you don't want to drive on. It would be like the roads in Ireland would be like driving Frogtown. Only the road was about 30% more narrow. I am not lying because I drove it. And I've been driving for all my life. And remember, you're driving on the other side of the road, and all the Irish are driving like a bat out of Hades. Yeah. Yeah, it's, in the words of Lou Piniella, it's not a good situation. I still have nightmares about that. And today, Ireland, unlike the rest of Europe, does not have a good train system, a good mass transit system. Ireland does not have that. Anyway, but it's a beautiful country. But yes, getting back to Oliver Cromwell crushed the Irish. They turned Ireland into a colony, and the British Isles, the England primarily, basically lived off the agricultural products that came from Ireland. For example, and I'm going to tell you this later on when we study it, the Great Potato Famine hit Ireland in 1847. The Irish potato famine, you say, what's that? Well, the Irish had become quite accustomed to, and I'm off the topic, it's not going to be on this test, but it's, all history's tied together. But the Irish had learned to live off the potato and, were surviving. And that was all they had to eat. And then in 1847, a blight, a disease, came across the Atlantic from the Americas to Ireland on ships. It struck the potato crop. The great tragedy of it was that the Irish planted the potatoes, and if you ever harvested potatoes, the potato is underground. They didn't know until they dug up the potato that there was nothing there. Shriveled little nodules. And in 1847 to 1848, in 1847, Ireland had a population of 8 million people. More people lived in Ireland in 1847 than live in Ireland today. Wrap your head around that. Yeah. And out of those 8 million people in 1847, 1 million of them died of starvation-related illnesses. Another 2 million, probably some of your ancestors, another 2 million got on board what they called coffin ships. Ships that had been used to haul slaves around, and they packed as many Irish as they could in there. And of course, naturally, some of these Irish were sick, and they were called coffin ships because as the sick Irish, they were jammed in there. As the sick Irish people died, they chunked them overboard. It was said that if, you'd leave a marker for every dead body, there would be, a graveyard all the way across the Atlantic. They were headed toward New York, New Orleans, and many to Canada. And 2 million left. It was said that schools of sharks followed the coffin ships across the Atlantic. So 1 million out of the 8 million died. 2 million more left. 5 million people were left. And Ireland was still desperately poor and being used by the British. We'll talk more about the Irish potato famine later on. Sorry, we haven't even started today's lecture yet. Think about that. And I've already been yammering on for 20 minutes. I tend to do that, although the information about Ireland is necessary. It's one of my favorite topics. So, back to the matter at hand. Oliver Cromwell treated the Irish poorly, and he treated the English people poorly too. Remember, the guy, he outlawed fun. And I hate to, please don't come and say, Mom, Mr. Horton said going to a brothel is fun. No. Well, that's what the English did for entertainment. He outlawed that. He shut down all the taverns. He shut down, all the horse racing. He shut down bear baiting and pit fighting. Bear baiting, we've already talked about that. And remember, Puritans don't like bear baiting, not because it's painful for the bear or dogs, but because the people enjoy it. Same thing with pit fighting, where you put 2 dogs together and one kills the other, or bare knuckle boxing, or any of the athletic events that people found joy in at the time. Those were all shut down because Oliver Cromwell saw them as being sinful. And finally, Oliver Cromwell did die. Okay, so now that takes us to where we are. So Charles II, the son of Charles I, returned to the throne in 1642. His return marked the status quo. Say, what does that mean? It means that this is what it means. So, I mean, think about it. You're Charles II. When Charles the First was beheaded, Charles II saw it. He saw his father get his head cut off. And you know what he did? He went to Paris. Answer, do you blame him? No. I mean, he's thinking, So he went to Paris. Well, after Oliver Cromwell died, the British government reached out to him, or the Parliament reached out to him and said, hey, that misunderstanding between us and your dad, that's all over with. How would you like to have your dad's job? Said Oliver Cromwell. I mean, it's quite interesting. Quite an interesting proposition. How would I like to have my dad's job? Well, so you're Oliver Cromwell, and you're going to go work with the same people that cut your father's head off. What kind of king will you be? Are you going to make trouble? There's the question. Are you going to make trouble for the same people that cut your father's head off? I don't know about you, but I'm not. So what are you going to do as king? What will you do as king? You're not going to make trouble. Answer, you're going to party like it's 1999. And that's exactly what he did. All those things that Oliver Cromwell had struck down, Charles II said, we opening back up, guys. Brothels open, the Shakespearean theater is open, taverns open, horse racing, pit fighting, all the pursuits, all the Christmas returns to England. And they did some major league partying, including and especially Charles II himself. There's actually a film that I've never seen. I read a review about it. Goodness, it's been 30 years ago. Yeah, I can do that. I can remember things I read 30 years ago. So what? I have an eidetic memory. It's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because you can win trivia at Drake's. It's a curse because if you get something in your mind, you can't get it out. And that includes good things, but also things that upset you. And sometimes that makes sleeping. Yeah. Anyway, so Charles II himself, there was this movie. The movie was called The Restoration, which, by the way, when Charles II, and you're writing, when Charles II was brought to the throne, this was called the Restoration period, the restoration of the monarchy. In fact, the film was called Restoration, and don't you dare try to go watch it. One thing, you'll never be able to find it, and you might be able to. Basically, Charles II basically does everything, he says, and looks directly into the camera. Everything. The movie had between an R and an X rating, so there. Does that help you? And no, I did not go see it. But anyway, in fact, because there was so much partying going on, and we're writing, because there was so much partying going on, England becomes known as jolly old England, or merry old England. Do you ever wonder where that came from? Merry old England came from the restoration of Charles II. Yeah. Okay, so his return marked the status quo. He was a hereditary monarch, and it was going to be assumed that his son would become the next monarch. Now the Anglican Church, with no bishops or prayer book, supreme in religion. Charles, however, had sympathies that ran with the Catholic Church, and he favored religious toleration, which allowed for free worship as long as the worshiper was loyal to the king. Parliament, however, did not think that one could be Catholic and loyal, a loyal Englishman. Yeah, that's a good thing to quote, to write down, to underline. Parliament then, because they were suspicious of Charles II, began passing a series of codes known as the Clarendon Code that excluded Roman Catholics, Presbyterians, and when it says independents, that means religious people, people who are religious and not Anglicans, religious minorities. And England during this time, you start to see the formation of some small independent religious groups. The laws also impose penalties for attending non-Anglican worship services. I've already mentioned to you what happened to Roman Catholics for conducting their worship services. That was part of this. Under Charles II, England entered into a series of economic wars against their Dutch sea rivals and enlisted the help of France to do it. In the Treaty of Dover, England became allied to France, their old enemy, who'll be their enemy again. In a secret provision of the treaty, Charles promised to announce his conversion to Roman Catholicism as soon as conditions in England permitted, which it never did. In an attempt to unite England behind the war effort and to show his support for Louis XIV of France, Charles passed the Declaration of Indulgence in 1672. That basically was a declaration that where the king basically tried to say Roman Catholicism was okay. As it says there, the conservative parliament shot this down. Charles then had to rescind the declaration. Parliament also passed the Test Act, which required all officials of the crown to swear an oath against the doctrine, oh, look at that word again, of transubstantiation. Now, why is that word? Oh, it has one S. Of transubstantiation. Please tell me you remember that word, transubstantiation. Transubstantiation, without me having to repeat it again, I shouldn't have to repeat it again, but transubstantiation was a core belief, a central belief of Roman Catholicism. And so, yeah, Charles II had to sign that Test Act as well. He had to swear an oath against believing that. Although the act was primarily directed at the brother of the king, James II, who we'll talk about later. So, in 1678, a man named Titus Oates swore before a magistrate. You say, what's a magistrate? Magistrate's a judge. Swore before a magistrate that Charles II's wife was plotting with Jesuits and Irishmen. That's funny. Jesuits and those wicked Irishmen. I'm telling you, the prejudice against the Irish held by the English was real. So, a plot that Charles II's wife was plotting with Jesuits and Irishmen to kill the king so that James II could assume the throne. This was called the Popish plot. Many people were tried and executed. Now, for the rest of his reign, Charles II, because the noose had come too close to his neck, and so he wasn't going to make any more trouble. He simply avoided calling together Parliament by basically borrowing money from Louis XIV and using. You say, what is duty collection? Duty collection. And that's not even a big word, 4 letters. What is a duty? And please don't mention anything about your younger siblings' diapers. No. But anyway, yes, duty. Have you ever been in an international flight or anything like that? And, you're allowed to visit the duty-free shop? A duty is a tax paid on products brought into a country. So all that means is that Charles II taxed certain items coming into the country. He put the money in his pocket, for his own personal use. When he died, on his deathbed, Charles II converted to Catholicism. James II was a out of the closet Catholic. All right, James II succeeded his brother, but his reign was short-lived. He demanded and received the repeal of the Test Act. And see, James II by this time is he's an old guy. I mean, really tragedy old. And most of the Parliament was like, we got to do this again. Put up with a Catholic. All right, he's old. He'll just die. And then, we'll be rid of him and we'll find a Protestant ruler and it'll be okay again. That's what they thought. So, getting back, he James II, demanded and received the repeal of the Test Act, which mentioned before. He imprisoned 7 bishops who refused to publicize his suspension of laws against Catholicism. You say, what does that mean? James II had 7 bishops in the Anglican Church imprisoned because they would not tell the congregations that these laws against Catholicism had been suspended. And so, James began to make overtures towards returning England back to Roman Catholicism. And, things were coming to Christ, but he kept saying, he's old, he's going to die. He has no children. However, James then marries again, and his second wife gave birth to a son, and that opened up the possibility of an entire line of Catholic kings in England. So Parliament said, we got to do something about this. And what they did was, as it says, good words. These words are on your test. Whig and Tory. Whig and Tory. Mr. Harton, you need a wig. Not the wig we're talking about. Whig. These are the first 2 political parties in the English Parliament. And they don't exist today. What are Whigs? Well, it's easier to say what are Tories. Tories were the party that supported the King of England. Whigs were the parties that supported, were more in favor of the Parliament being in power. Tories king, Whigs Parliament. Okay? But a Whig and Tory coalition of Parliament, that meant that the 2 parties got together and they offered the throne of England to Mary, who was James's oldest daughter, who had converted to Protestantism because she married the Dutch Protestant William of Orange. William brought his army to England. There was no army to oppose him in England. And James II. James II saw what was happening and did this right here because, he thought, I would be beheaded again. And so he hightailed it to France. And William and Mary become the new monarchs of England without firing a shot. This is called the Glorious or Bloodless Revolution. This is called the Glorious or Bloodless Revolution. You wrote that down? Mm-hmm. So William brought his army to England unopposed, didn't fire a shot. This was called the Glorious or Bloodless Revolution to preserve traditional liberties, the Anglican Church, and parliamentary government. Well, I think that is about all for today. And I'm going to call it a day, and I will tomorrow I will see you all in school, and I hope you have a good evening. So there it is. Goodbye now.